Hey, so this is going to be a video about communism and more specifically Karl Marx himself and some of the differences between Marxism and communism in the days of old when he first crafted it and today, as well as both the things I disagree and agree with about it. So, let's go ahead and get into it. um, kind of why I wanted to make this video is that I've been watching a lot of stuff recently about revolutions and then recently about Karl Marx himself, and a lot of thoughts have been kind of percolating in my head about, some of the differences between communism in the days of old and, whether or not communism, just in a nutshell, is a positive thing in the world. And, um, you know, I guess starting off kind of with my areas of criticism of it, or actually before I get into that too much, just kind of why, again, I wanted to make this video. One thing I recently thought about when I was watching an old video of Karl Marx, a documentary about him, was I didn't really ever think about just how big of the gap there was between when Karl Marx died and then when communist revolutions actually occurred. He still died, a long time before most of the communist revolutions, particularly that of the Soviet Union, occurred. And I wonder what his thoughts would have been on the byproduct of what happened. Obviously it did not go as he planned. He had planned that he had at least said that they would happen in England or the United States because he considered the industrialized countries to be the most ripe for the next stage of human evolution, which would be communism. Of course, capitalism being the stage that preceded that, with the bourgeoisie being created by the Industrial Revolution and the proletariat being the working class being ruled by it. But, he was wrong. It happened in Russia and China, two countries that were not industrialized. And Russia still had a very old czarist regime with the church being part of the state, feudalism still somewhat intact. China had, the old dynasty still in place that had been there for thousands of years. So, it did not go like he thought. And I'm 100% 100% sure Karl Marx would not have been on board with the actions of Stalin or Mao. Again, this is not saying this as someone who's relatively critical of Marxism and communism, not someone who's a supporter of his, but I mean it'd be hard for almost anyone to be a supporter of those two's actions. They're considered two of the most evil men in history, and in some ways they were enabled by the communist revolutions. Which kind of brings me to some of my areas of criticism of communism and Marxism. I mean, first and foremost, why I mostly disavow the system, and why in the 21st century I really think anyone should disavow the system. I mean, 100 years ago, we didn't quite know how communism was going to play out. And in theory, it sounds really good. Everybody being equal, religion being removed by the state. As an atheist, I can't help but like that. Classes being removed. Well, and of course, this will all be done for us by the government. And I mean, to anybody with a little bit of suspicions, a little bit of thinking, though, and a little bit of knowledge of certain aspects of how the government works in human nature, though, there are some red flags in that because we all know that humans by nature are not entirely equal, and the government cannot be trusted with absolute power. But of course, Karl Marx did trust that the state of communism would eventually arise from the dictatorship of the proletariat. And as we realize, that did not happen. The dictatorship never ended in either Russia or China. And it leads to a totalitarian system through and through. Also, my biggest qualm really with communism is an economic one. I do lean towards free market capitalism. I was a finance major in college, and that's part of the reason why I have a relatively decent understanding of business and economics. And a lot of people just don't realize, well, I wouldn't say I'm a pure capitalist or a pure socialist. There are just major, major problems that come when you completely centralize an economy. Okay, it makes it very, very hard. I mean, business is hard to do in the first place, but it makes it 10 times harder when everything has to go through the government. And inevitably, it does an incredible amount to reduce, reduce productivity of workers. And people are by nature a little bit selfish. People are also by nature, some people just can be trusted with more than others can, in terms of money. And I don't mean myself being like the type that can be trusted with billions of dollars. I can't be. I do stupid stuff with money. Some people, though, can't be trusted with $2, and you never know what they'll do with it. I mean, and the same goes with money in business. Some people can run an entire business empire with their eyes closed. Others, are lucky to hold any 9-to-5 job that they're given, at any level. We're not all equal in our talents. We may be equal under the law, we're equal in our gender, we're equal in race, but we're not equal we're not equal in our talents, and the overall outcome of our lives, both personally and financially, will never be equal. And that's another issue I have with Marxism. Just philosophically, I don't agree entirely with the idea of equality, at least not in the financial and economic sense. Also, as an atheist, while I definitely somewhat understand certain actions of the communists in trying to make the state secular and trying to push back against religion, essentially doing a little bit of bullying to the religious bullies who have, bullied other religions and atheists for centuries, I can fully understand the appeal of that. And to some small extent, I don't think trying to secularize the state and do a little bit to push back on the many centuries of indoctrination that on the part of the state for religion that has occurred is entirely wrong. And I think in some ways it is a little bit even in order. However, violent action towards religious people, actual attempts to completely indoctrinate people away from their religious views, that is not something I support. As Nietzsche would say, I'm butchering this quote a little, but don't be so busy fighting monsters lest you become one yourself. That's butchered, I know, but that's basically the bottom line. Don't become the very thing you're trying to destroy. And I think some atheists end up doing that when they become so desperate to fight the religions that have been oppressing people for so long that they really want to just obliterate them entirely and do the same things that the religious have done to atheists for a long time, And I don't agree with that, particularly, and being specifically here, I'm referring to like Joseph Stalin's executing of thousands of priests, actual demolishing of churches, same thing that's currently being done in communist China today. It's more against Muslims there than Christians, but basically there's persecution of Muslims, there's indoctrination camps where they try to indoctrinate people away from their religious views. I don't support any of that. Okay, that's the total wrong way to go about this. But anyways, I think there is a huge difference, however, between communism in the days of old and Marxism, as well as communism today, though. Now, in the days of old, actually, despite the fact that there was very violent, bloody revolutions, both in China and Russia, I think it was much more understandable why communism took hold back in those days. It is an appealing doctrine if you've never seen it in practice. However, we have now seen it in practice for over a century, and it has not went so well. However, they had no way of knowing that someone like, they probably never would have suspected that someone like Joseph Stalin would have come to power, or Mao Zedong, or that when they got to power, they would have been nearly as cruel and as totalitarian as they were. And people probably thought there would have been more checks and balances on them than that. I can understand, and let me put it this way. I might be more liberal than conservative, so this might surprise some of you to hear me say this, but years ago, back when I was more conservative, as I was raised that way, I listened to a talk radio host called Michael Savage. And trust me, as his name implies, he was pretty wild. And he actually had one pretty good quote, though, about the Occupy Wall Street movement that was going on at the time. He criticized it heavily and said, and compared it to the Bolsheviks of, a century before for the communist revolution. He said there's no comparison between the two. The Bolsheviks were starving. They were desperate, and they were just desperately looking to overturn the Tsarist regime that was destroying their lives. And it's why they turned to communism. The Occupy Wall Streeters are a bunch of fat, drugged-out college kids. And he's right. A lot of them were they weren't desperate. They may not have, been rich or whatever. They may not have had, everything in life. But they had food. They had shelter if they wanted it. They had, the bare necessities. These were people that were, more just professional agitators. And there's a big difference. And, I know not all Occupy Wall Street protesters are communists. But my point being, I think there's a lot less excuse to be a communist in the modern world in the 21st century than there was back in the late 19th, early 20th century. Back then, people didn't quite know what was going to happen when the communist revolutions occurred. Now we know. In almost every occasion, there was some pretty violent revolutions in the beginning, though admittedly that was not all the fault of the communists. Okay, there was a brutal civil war in Russia, a brutal civil war in China, in Vietnam, in Korea. All of these with outside entities fighting against the communists, usually. China's a little complicated because I don't know that you could say the Japanese were necessarily on the side of the nationalists, but I mean, I don't know. Definitely, in the Russian Civil War, the White Russians, with the help of the, European powers, were definitely being waged against the Red Russians. So, I mean, that's not entirely their fault, these violent civil wars. However, certain actions are pretty hard to defend, like when Stalin came to power and the forced starvations that occurred from his collectivization, as well as the collectivizations in China and the Cultural Revolution, that whether it was through insidiousness or incompetence, I don't know, though I lean more towards the latter. Millions did die. That's not an exaggeration, and that is a testament to the ineffectiveness of certain aspects of the communist system. However, for the people that look at that and use that as a reason to dismiss literally everything and anything that has to do with communism or anything about liberalism in general, or specifically atheism, because a lot of people use that as a charge against atheism, is the failures of communism. I'm not quite so sure about that. I mean, for one, yeah, Stalin was a pretty bad person, and he did some very stupid things in addition to doing some very bad things. But to be 100% honest, I don't know that he was infinitely worse than the regime that came before him. And let's not forget, not every leader that was communist that came after Stalin was even remotely as bad as him. I mean, I don't know that Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev were all angels, but compared to Stalin, they were. The same goes for a lot of the heads of China, since Mao Zedong died. But even, looking at the overall track record of the Soviet Union and of Stalin, I don't know that it's an entirely negative one. I mean, Stalin was evil, but let's not forget, Stalin did one very big service to this world, and he defeated Hitler. And as someone who knows quite a bit about Hitler and Stalin, probably more than a normal person should, I can assure you Stalin was less dangerous than Hitler. Hitler was a crazy madman that could have brought the whole world to its knees, potentially. Stalin was just your typical brutal dictator, megalomaniac who consolidated power and crushed anyone in his way. To be honest, he did it on a larger level than most people, but he wasn't that tremendously unusual, Hitler was, but that's another story. But he did, the Soviet Union and broke the back of the German Wehrmacht, and that's really what almost did more to win the war against Germany than anything else. I'm not saying the US and Britain did not play a part in it, that's for sure. But I mean, really, the Russians suffered more casualties in that war against them than any other country has ever suffered in human history, So, where I'm going with this, though, is that the modernized Soviet Union did probably a much better job of standing up to Nazi Germany than the old czarist, feudalistic regime ever could have. And it was because of the industrializations and the modernizations that had occurred under Lenin and Stalin, at least in part, And, then let's not forget the Soviet Union was a much, much bigger competitor to the US than Russia even has a chance of being in the modern world. Partially because it had other countries under its control, but even despite its economic ineffectiveness, it was still, on the whole, economically more successful than Russia is now in its Putinocracy. And it was probably, though I know this might be a little debatable, I mean, you look at how Russia was under the Tsarist, where they still had feudalism and people were starving. Well, I think on the whole, you can make the case that excluding Stalin's brief stint where he did the forced starvations, which were more out of brutality than economic ineffectiveness, that the Soviet Union on the whole still fared economically better than it did before or after the communist takeover. Again, that's a long and detailed debate, and one that obviously I don't have the time, energy, or data to go into here. But I mean, if you look at the numbers over time, I mean, GDP per capita, average incomes, actually on the whole were better in the Soviet Union than they were and than they are in modern Russia. And now I'm not so sure before entirely, but let's not forget again, the majority of people were in serfdom before that in Russia. So it's a little hard to say because I know, obviously, again, I'm getting repetitive here, but Stalin, things were not great under him. But where I'm just going with this is that, I don't know that the communist revolution was entirely negative in Russia. China is more complicated, and honestly, I'm not going to just talk about it a great deal here just because it's a little harder to comment on, how China was before and after, since China's technically still communist, but they're becoming less communist every day. So I don't know. I won't talk about China quite as much here. But, you know, I look at the impacts of communism, and while it was a flawed system, and it still is, you know, the way that people try to use communism as the boogeyman to write off pretty much anything and everything that had, you know, the communism touched is, I think, a mistake as well. You know, I mean, in some ways, you know, I think people do a little bit the same with certain types of right-wing thinking as well. You know, I mean, anything that even comes remotely close to certain forms of fascism, people just immediately cringe at, you know, because they think of the Nazis and Mussolini and Franco of Spain. And, you know, for instance, I mean, militarism in general. While I definitely support less military, you know, less military buildup and overall less wars, I do think war is hugely overused throughout history. I recognize we're not yet to a point where societies like we're post-war era where there's not going to be, you know, major conflicts anymore. There is still a need for militaries and soldiers, and some people like think just about anything to do with the military equates to fascism, or anything to do with, you know, some government control or intervention in day-to-day life equates with fascism. You know, at least that's what liberals will say, and the conservatives will call it communism. But I mean, where I'm kind of going with this is that, you know, especially when I look at what Karl Marx, I think Karl Marx himself deserves a little bit of a break. Because let's not forget, Karl Marx was just a writer. He didn't do any revolutions. He didn't kill anybody. He just wrote books. And they may have been slightly controversial ideas, but he didn't actually put any of them to practice. That was some of his followers. And again, in many of these cases, I'm not sure that the alternative would have necessarily been a world better. You know, again, going back to Russia, what would have happened if the White Russians won? Would it have been better? Well, maybe. I don't know. I mean, it maybe would have. I really am not sure, because the White Russians had a lot of different, you know, I feel kind of weird saying that, like the White Russians, like I'm saying like that's the race of Russians or whatever. But White Russians, of course, were just, you know, the mix of Russians that stood for other causes that were aligned against the communists. And honestly, it's hard to say exactly what would have happened if the White Russians would have won, but it would have been probably a more moderate regime, and it might have been much, much better than the communists. But I don't know that it would have, you know, because look at, you know, the Mao Zedong and, you know, the nationalists, or sorry, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists in China who fought against Mao Zedong. I mean, again, I don't know that they were better, but I mean, or that they were worse, but I don't know that they were better either. I mean, they were quite cruel in the way they fought against the communists and Mao Zedong, and I mean, I don't know. I can't say, I'm not qualified to say it's more than I could talk about it as to what things would have been better. But, you know, people always seem to assume that, you know, if the people who had been fighting against the communists would have won, that things would have been so much better. I mean, there are clear cases where you can see certain aspects, you know, and better, you know, for, I guess, the anti-communist forces, like in South Korea. It's pretty easy to make the case that South Korea is better off than North Korea. But, I mean, they get a lot of help from the U.S. I mean, to keep them as a relatively high-functioning democracy, they get a lot of free trade. You know, they help from the United States. I mean, you know, so I don't know. I mean, again, I'm not a communist. I believe more in free market and more in a democracy as opposed to communism. But to be 100% honest with you, I'm not entirely sure that things would have been as happy and wonderful as people say they would have been in these countries had the communists lost, you know. For instance, like what we see in Russia now under Putin. Is Russia doing better? No, it's not. Unequivocally, not just my opinion, it's not doing better. Russia has tremendous amounts of corruption within the country. Putin is regressing the social clock backwards in Russia. He's more aggressive than the Soviet Union was under the premiers that headed the Soviet Union. In his recent invasion of Ukraine, he's proven that, which is a very stupid and very bloody war, you know, one that is costing, at the moment, it's still hundreds of thousands. It might be over 1 million before it's all said and done in lives. We haven't seen a war like that in Europe since World War II, you know. And communists, you know, yeah, they may not have been perfect, but the Cold War never went hot. They never got into a nuclear war with the United States. And on several occasions, we were almost closer to starting the nuclear war with them than they were with us. And I'm, you know, criticizing my own country on that one. You know, there's numerous occasions where my jaw drops when I listen to some of the things floated around by back in the days of like Truman about actually, just lobbing a nuke at the Russians to put them in their place. It's just shocking. If people think Trump or Biden or Harris are really that scary, just look at the stuff some of our past presidents have said, and you're not going to be that worried anymore, because I guarantee you they've said shit that's 10 times crazier, you know? But anyways, I guess, the overall point of this video is, I know I probably irritate people on both sides of the spectrum with this, because the communists will listen to me criticize it, and, the communists in the modern world, and they'll be mad, like, how dare you criticize it? You just don't realize that communism hasn't been done right yet, which is the same thing I hear Christians say. The only difference is at least communists only have 100 years of failed history. Christians have thousands of years of failed history, and they just keep saying, well, we're just not doing it right yet. We finally got it right here. In the year 2024, we finally have come up with the most recent interpretation of it. Well, the same thing with communists. They're always figuring out some way to finally do it right, But yeah, they'll hate me for the criticisms, and then some people would hate me for even saying anything positive about communism, I have to word it pretty carefully whenever I'm around some conservatives, and I try to say something relatively complimentary about communism, like a lot of my family members, like, I'll say, but I keep it pretty simple. I just say it like I said here, and that's that, well, as opposed to Tsarism, feudalistic Tsarism, or, the ancient dynasties of China, I think it was probably an improvement upon those, and I still do believe that. And I also do believe that Karl Marx, while he may have been wrong on at least half of what he wrote, I don't think he was wrong about every single thing. I think Karl Marx did understand that, there were some problems, especially back in the early 20th and late 19th century in the Industrial Revolution, with very bad exploitation of workers, and he did point that out, even though I don't agree with his, treatment for that condition of society. But he was also very right, too, I think, about, how he called religion the opium of the people. I do believe that religion, in many ways, is used as a drug to nullify the pain of life, and also used to control people as well, and I agree with him there. Once again, I just don't agree with his solution that the government should be the one trying to eradicate religion. And lastly, I just really don't agree with also his idea of giving the government absolute power, to eventually create this state of nirvana, because I have a tendency to be, distrustful of the government as well as human nature in general, and think no human can have absolute power, and I think, history has taught us that. But, still sometimes I always find Marxism to be a little bit interesting to read, though I usually get, more bored with it the more I read it. I read I don't know, 2 pages of Das Kapital, and I couldn't make it any further through that years ago, because it's so boring. And then I've listened to read the Communist Manifesto a few times, and it's interesting, but it's on the whole not what I call exhilarating, because it's got a lot of parts of it that are just kind of outdated and stupid. But, overall, I think communism is still something that needs to be talked about in the 21st century, because while the actual ideology doesn't exist in the form that it used to, it still carries a lot of relevance, and it's still a lot of the things discussed that relate to communism, like economic inequality, religion, and how to deal with religion in society. These are all still questions that linger hugely in the modern day world. And, we need to look at the mistakes that both liberals and conservatives made in the past in order to figure out how to not repeat them in the future. So, as usual, thanks for listening to me rant about this, and if you find it interesting, feel free to comment below. But as usual, thanks for watching, and see you next time. Bye.